Imagine a thriving community, a respected doctor, a loving family, and then, in the dead of night, unimaginable horror. This is the chilling story of the double homicide that shattered the peace of an Ohio town and left everyone asking, who could do this to such a beloved couple? In the quiet suburbs of Ohio, there is a specific kind of silence that accompanies a heavy snowfall. It is a blanket that softens the world, turning high-end neighborhoods into rows of pristine, white-capped monuments to success. In November of 1996, on a street defined by its peace and its prosperity, that silence became absolute. This was the world of Dr. Harrison Miller and his wife, Diane. To look at their lives was to observe a life of consistency. Harrison was the town's most trusted dental surgeon, a man whose steady hands and gentle laugh had comforted 3 generations of patients. Diane was the heartbeat of the community, a tireless organizer of local charities whose calendar was a crowded map of good deeds and neighborhood gatherings. They lived in a home that was a testament to that consistency, a sprawling, elegant residence where the lights were always on by 6 a.m. and the doors were rarely locked during the day. Their lives were an open book, a narrative of hard work and public service that everyone in town believed they understood. But on one particular Tuesday night in 1996, the consistency stopped. There were no alarms. No neighbors reported hearing the frantic barking of a dog or the sound of a struggle. The house simply went dark. When the morning sun rose over the frosted windows, the Millers didn't emerge. There was no forced entry. The heavy oak door stood closed, and the security system remained silent. Inside, the community's sense of safety was shattered by a discovery that defied explanation. A silent, double homicide that left investigators standing in a home where everything was in its place, yet everything had changed. For nearly 30 years, the case was a void. It was a story without a final chapter, a tragedy that the town of Wauseon eventually folded into its history as an unsolvable mystery. The Miller home changed hands, the children grew up, and the yellowed files in the evidence locker began to gather the dust of 3 decades. Until now. We shift our focus to November 2025. The snow is falling once again, coating the same suburban streets in white, but the vehicles moving through the neighborhood this time do not belong to the local patrol. A specialized cold case task force, equipped with tools that didn't exist when the Millers were alive, has returned to this quiet corner of Ohio. They aren't here to search the woods or canvass the neighbors for old memories. They are here for a specific destination. They are here because the new evidence has finally arrived, and the person they are looking for has been watching the snow fall from a nearby window for 29 years. The mask of the model neighbor is about to be removed. Before we continue with this chilling story, we would like you to subscribe and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. It will encourage us to do more and also help the algorithm to suggest our video to more people who like resolved cold cases like this one. To truly grasp the magnitude of what occurred in the winter of 1996, we have to look past the tragedy and into the life that preceded it. In the landscape of mid-90s Ohio, Dr. Harrison Miller and his wife, Diane, were more than just residents. They were a landmark. They represented the peak of suburban achievement. At that time, Harrison wasn't just a dentist. He was the person you consulted when you needed sound advice or a steady hand. He was a man who moved through the world with a deliberate, quiet confidence. A man of high standing whose presence at a local board meeting or a high school football game signaled that everything was as it should be. Diane Miller complemented this public image with a grace that seemed effortless. She was the architect of the town's social fabric, the woman who knew every neighbor's name and every family's history. In 1996, if a local library needed funding or a family was in need of a warm meal, Diane was the first phone call made. They were the model neighbors, the people everyone turned to, living a life that appeared to be a masterclass in stability and community devotion. Their home was not just a house, it was a beacon of the American dream, perfectly maintained and always welcoming. Central to this image of perfection was Harrison's dental practice. When you walked through those glass doors, you were entering a world of clinical excellence. It was a space defined by a sterile, bright, and welcoming environment. The air smelled of peppermint and high-grade disinfectant, a scent that reassured every patient they were in the best possible hands. The waiting room featured plush chairs and the latest medical journals, neatly arranged on mahogany tables. The staff was efficient, the equipment was state-of-the-art for the 90s, and Harrison himself was always there, dressed in a crisp white coat, offering a reassuring word to everyone from toddlers to the elderly. This was his professional mask, a carefully maintained surface of order, hygiene, and absolute reliability. To the outside observer, the practice was a goldmine of success and a testament to Harrison's undisputed skill. However, beneath this veneer of porcelain and polished floors, a different reality was beginning to form, a shadow that remained invisible to the townspeople and even the most seasoned investigators of the time. While the public saw a thriving business, a deep dive into the internal mechanics of the practice reveals a much more complex story. In the mid-90s, the digital infrastructure we rely on today simply didn't exist. Record-keeping was a world of ledgers, physical receipts, and paper trails that could be easily obscured. This is where the first seed of doubt finds its footing. When we look at the archived financial records through a modern lens, we see a secondary life emerging within the numbers. Harrison Miller was a man caught in a widening gap between his public status and his private obligations. The records show a series of hidden transactions, small at first, then growing in frequency and scale. There were high-interest loans taken out from out-of-state lenders, funds moved between accounts with no clear explanation, and a mounting level of debt that was completely at odds with the busy waiting room and the expensive suburban lifestyle. In 1996, the local police lacked the specialized forensic accounting tools required to untangle such a sophisticated web of finances. They saw the bright office and the successful doctor, and they assumed the finances were as healthy as the patient's teeth. They couldn't see that the practice was becoming a house of cards, held together by a desperate series of financial maneuvers. This shadow life was a world of hushed phone calls made from the office after the staff had gone home, and a growing pressure to maintain an image that was becoming increasingly expensive to support. The Millers were living a paradox. They were the pillars of the community, the people who had it all together, yet Harrison was quietly navigating a financial labyrinth. Every morning, he would put on the white coat, adjust the professional mask, and step into the bright, sterile light of his practice, greeting his neighbors with the same gentle smile he had used for 20 years. No one noticed the slight tremor in his hand as he reviewed the morning mail. No one heard the silence in the house when the bills arrived. The model neighbors were standing on a foundation that was far less solid than it appeared. While Diane continued her charitable work, believing in the permanence of their success, Harrison was managing a secret that was beginning to weigh as heavily as the lead aprons in his X-ray room. This hidden layer of their lives, this secondary narrative of debt and undisclosed agreements, is the key to understanding why the house went dark that November night. It provides the context for a tragedy that the initial investigation couldn't grasp because they were looking at the mask, not the man behind it. The shadow was not a sudden event, but a gradual accumulation of choices made in the pursuit of maintaining a status that had become a burden. It was a quiet crisis, tucked away in filing cabinets and encrypted in the margins of professional success. As 1996 drew toward its close, the tension between the public perfection and the private struggle reached a point where something had to give. The consistency of their lives was not a shield, it was a cage, and the person who finally broke that cage was someone who understood the shadow better than anyone else. As we move forward into the reconstruction of that final Tuesday, we must keep this hidden reality in mind. The image of the Millers as the perfect couple wasn't a lie, but it was incomplete. The truth was far more layered, involving professional rivalries and financial stakes that would take nearly 30 years to fully surface. The silence of the snow-covered street in 1996 wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of a secret that was finally too heavy to carry.
In the aftermath of November 1996, the investigation into the lives of the Millers began with an intensity that matched the community's shock. But very quickly, the authorities in Ohio encountered a phenomenon known as the forensic gap. To understand this, we have to remember that in 1996, the science of criminal investigation was in a state of transition. We were living in an era where the tools of the past were no longer enough, and the tools of the future were still out of reach. At the crime scene, the Fulton County investigators were meticulous. They spent hundreds of hours processing the Miller residence, looking for the one mistake that would provide a name. They did find physical evidence, items that in today's world would be considered a gold mine. They recovered a single powder-free latex glove, found discarded near the perimeter of the property, partially obscured by the fresh snowfall. Nearby, they discovered a specialized dental tool, a stainless steel elevator used in complex extractions, which did not belong to the set Dr. Miller kept in his home office. In 1996, DNA technology was in its infancy. It was a tool used primarily for high-profile cases with large amounts of biological material. The touch DNA we rely on today, the ability to pull a genetic profile from the skin cells left inside a glove or on the handle of a tool, was the stuff of science fiction. The lab could confirm that the glove had been worn, but the sample was too small, too degraded by the cold, to yield a profile that could be run through any database. The dental tool was wiped clean of prints. The evidence was collected, cataloged, and placed into a cardboard box where it would sit for decades, a silent witness to a science that wasn't yet ready to speak. Because the science hit a wall, the investigation had to rely on traditional police work, which led to a period of intense and ultimately successful misdirection. Without a genetic smoking gun, the authorities were forced to follow theories based on motive and opportunity. The first and most obvious theory was that of a botched robbery. The Millers were affluent. They lived in a home that suggested wealth. Perhaps, the investigators thought, an outsider had seen the lights in the window and assumed there was a safe filled with cash or jewelry. But this theory quickly crumbled. Nothing of value had been taken. Diane's jewelry sat on her nightstand. Harrison's wallet was still in his jacket. The house was orderly, the silence of the scene suggesting that the intruder hadn't come for property, but for the people. Then the focus shifted to Dr. Miller's professional life. Detectives began to look for a disgruntled patient. Dentistry is a profession where pain is often a factor, and the police wondered if someone had allowed a grievance over a procedure or a bill to transform into a physical confrontation. They interviewed hundreds of patients, looking for a history of complaints or threats. They combed through the life of consistency that Harrison had built at the office, but they found only a man who was deeply respected by those he treated. While the police were looking toward the horizon for a stranger or a vengeful patient, the person responsible was moving within their innermost circle. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the 1996 narrative to reconcile. The actual perpetrator was interviewed by investigators in early 1997. In fact, they were interviewed multiple times. In the records from that time, this individual is described as cooperative, grieving, and extraordinarily helpful. They provided the police with insights into Harrison's dental practice. They offered theories about who might have wanted to harm the couple. They even sat with the Miller children, offering a shoulder to lean on. When the detectives reviewed their list of suspects, this person was consistently moved to the bottom. The prevailing logic of 1997 was that the perpetrator must be someone with an obvious, visible motive, someone angry, someone outsider. This individual was dismissed precisely because they were deemed too close to the victims to be considered a threat. The investigators fell into a common cognitive trap. They believed that closeness implied loyalty. They couldn't conceive of a scenario where someone who shared a dinner table with the Millers, someone who worked alongside Harrison, could be capable of such a quiet and calculated act. The suspect used this proximity as a shield. By being the first to volunteer for search parties and the loudest voice calling for justice, they made themselves invisible. They were hiding in the very center of the investigation, using the model neighbor status they shared with the victims to deflect any possible scrutiny. As the months turned into years, the lack of a DNA match and the failure of the botched robbery theory caused the case to lose momentum. The misdirection had worked perfectly. The perpetrator didn't flee the state. They didn't change their name. They stayed in Ohio, continuing their own life of professional achievement, confident that the forensic gap of 1996 would never be bridged. They believed that as long as they remained the helpful friend, the box in the evidence locker would remain closed. The wall the investigation hit wasn't made of a lack of effort. It was made of the limitations of the era. The police were looking for a monster, but the person who entered the Miller home that night didn't look like a monster. He looked like a colleague. He looked like a friend. He was a man who understood the professional mask because he wore one himself. The silence that settled on the Miller case wasn't just the silence of the snow. It was the silence of a secret that had been successfully integrated into the community. For 30 years, the latex glove and the dental tool remained in the dark, waiting for a world where closeness was no longer a defense against the truth. The investigation had hit a wall, but as we are about to see, walls have a way of crumbling when the light of the future finally hits them.
For 30 years, the story of the Millers existed in a state of suspended animation. In the world of law enforcement, there is a specific destination for stories that lose their momentum: the basement evidence lockers. This is where the cold case box resides. It is a humble cardboard container reinforced with tape, sitting on a high metal shelf among thousands of others. Inside, the blue latex glove and the stainless steel dental elevator were sealed in plastic, protected from the air, but disconnected from the world. When a case enters this space, it undergoes a transformation. It becomes what investigators call a ghost case. It is no longer a part of the daily briefing. It is no longer the subject of urgent phone calls or high-stakes meetings. Instead, it becomes a shadow that follows the department through the decades. Lead detectives retired, taking their handwritten notes and their lingering frustrations with them. New officers joined the force, seeing the Miller file only as a legendary mystery from a previous era, a story whispered about during late-night shifts, but never truly expected to be solved. The physical evidence remained frozen, but the world outside the locker room continued to age, oblivious to the fact that the truth was sitting in the dark less than 50 feet below the sidewalk. As the case cooled, the lives of those left behind were shaped by the lack of resolution. The survivors, the Miller children, grew up in a reality that was fundamentally different from the life of consistency their parents had provided. To understand the impact of a 30-year freeze, one must listen to the voices of those who remained. In archival interviews from the early 2000s and more recent conversations leading up to 2025, the children describe a life lived in a permanent state of what if. They speak of a childhood that was bisected by that November night,
Before, there were music lessons, holiday traditions, and the absolute certainty that their father and mother would be at every graduation and wedding. After, there was a house that felt too large, a community that looked at them with a mixture of pity and unease, and a haunting question that never let them rest. One of the sons recounted, "You don't just lose your parents, you lose your sense of trust in the world. You look at every friendly face in town and you wonder, were you there? Did you know?" The shadow of the unsolved crime followed them into adulthood, affecting their own relationships and their ability to feel truly at peace in the town they once called home. While the survivors navigated this long-term grief, the suspect was engaged in a masterful exercise of a second life. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the 30-year freeze to examine. The suspect didn't flee into the night. He didn't disappear into a different country or adopt a new name. He remained in Ohio, less than an hour's drive from the very site where the Miller's story was interrupted. He used those 30 years to build a life that was, on the surface, undistinguishable from the one Harrison Miller had led. He built a successful business, one that required the same level of trust and community involvement that Harrison had enjoyed. He became a fixture in local commerce, a person who sponsored Little League teams and donated to the same charities Diane had championed. He was the man who was always there to offer a handshake or a professional recommendation. Even more chilling was his continued presence in the lives of the Millers' extended social circle. Over the course of 30 years, he attended the memorial services. He stood among the mourners at the 10-year, 20-year, and 25-year vigils. He was seen shaking hands with the survivors, offering words of comfort that appeared entirely genuine to anyone watching. He had integrated himself so deeply into the community's fabric that his presence at these events was not only accepted, but expected. He had created a narrative of being a loyal friend who was also shattered by the loss, effectively using his feigned grief as the ultimate camouflage. The suspect lived with the knowledge of what he had done for 10,950 days. He watched his own children grow up, he celebrated his own milestones, and he built a reputation for integrity, all while knowing that the dental tool in the basement locker belonged to him. He operated under the assumption that the 1996 forensic gap was a permanent barrier. He believed that the silence of the cardboard box was his protection. For 30 years, he was right. The community grew to respect him. The police stopped looking his way. The survivors learned to live with the pain. But the freeze was not a permanent state. It was merely a delay. While the suspect was busy polishing his second life, the world of science was quietly catching up to him. The ghost case was about to be summoned back into the light, and the man who had spent 30 years hiding in plain sight was about to realize that the evidence didn't need a witness, it only needed time. The 30-year freeze was a profound injustice for the Millers, but it was also the time required for the biological roadmap to be completed. Every hand the suspect shook, every memorial he attended, and every year he spent building his business only added to the weight of the eventual reveal. The silence of 1996 was coming to an end, and as we move into the breakthrough of 2025, we see that the truth isn't something that can be buried, it is something that waits for the right moment to be seen.
For nearly 3 decades, the evidence in the Miller case was considered a dead end, a collection of silent objects that had reached the limit of their utility. But as we transitioned into 2025, the boundary between what is unsolvable and what is known began to dissolve. The ghost case was about to be reanimated by a level of scientific precision that would have seemed like magic to the investigators of 1996. The 2025 breakthrough began with a process that sounds remarkably simple, but is conceptually profound: mineral DNA extraction. In 1996, the stainless steel dental elevator found at the scene was swabbled for traditional biological material, But the technology of the time could not detect the microscopic remnants trapped within the porous surfaces of the metal itself. Modern forensic scientists now understand that mineral surfaces and high-grade surgical steel can act as a preservative for genetic material, shielding it from the elements. Using a proprietary vacuum pulse technology, investigators in 2025 revisited that discarded dental tool. They were looking for what is known as low-copy DNA, fragments so small they are measured in trillionths of a gram. By applying a specialized saline solution and high-frequency vibrations, the lab was able to dislodge cellular material that had been wedged into the microscopic imperfections of the steel handle for 29 years. When the resulting data was processed, it yielded something the 1996 lab could only dream of: a full, high-fidelity genetic profile. The tool that had sat in a cardboard box for 3 decades was no longer a piece of cold metal. It was a biological witness. However, the DNA profile was only the first half of the revelation. As the forensic team examined the dental tool under a high-powered electron microscope, they discovered what the lead investigator called the shocker. Lodged in the tip of the elevator was a microscopic fragment of dental porcelain, no larger than a grain of dust. To a layperson, it looked like common debris, but to a forensic odontologist, it was a fingerprint of a different kind. Analysis of the porcelain's chemical composition revealed a specific signature of alumina and rare earth oxides. This wasn't a standard off-the-shelf material. It was a proprietary ceramic blend produced by a single manufacturer in Germany, distributed to a very limited number of practitioners in the mid-1990s. When investigators ran this chemical signature through state-of-the-art dental supply databases, the results were staggering. In the entire state of Ohio in 1996, this specific porcelain blend was utilized by only 2 practices. One was Dr. Miller's own office. The other belonged to a colleague who worked less than 10 miles away. Suddenly, the random robbery theory wasn't just unlikely, it was mathematically impossible. The physical evidence pointed toward a very specific professional world, a world of shared suppliers, shared materials, and shared secrets. But even with a DNA profile and a rare piece of porcelain, the authorities needed a name to attach to the data. This is where the digital and biological worlds converged to create what we now call the biological roadmap. The resolution did not come from a criminal database. It came from the millions of ordinary citizens who had uploaded their data to public ancestry platforms over the previous decade. In late 2024, a distant relative, a second cousin of the suspect, submitted a DNA kit to an online genealogy service, hoping to map their family tree. They had no idea that their curiosity would light up a path that had been dark since 1996. Forensic genealogists in 2025 utilized this relative's data to build a complex inverted family tree. By triangulating the DNA of the second cousin with other distant matches, they were able to identify a common set of great-grandparents. From that point, the roadmap began to narrow with surgical precision. They mapped every descendant, every marriage, and every geographic location of that family branch over the last 50 years. The task was monumental. They began with a potential pool of 100,000 residents in the tri-state area. But as they filtered the list by age, gender, and most importantly, professional background, the branches of the tree began to fall away. They looked for someone with dental training. They looked for someone who was in Ohio in November of 1996. They looked for someone who was part of that model neighbor social circle. The roadmap led to one and only one destination. The 100,000 names were filtered down to 10, then to 3, and finally to a single man. It was a name the investigators recognized immediately. It was the man who had been interviewed in 1997. It was the man who had stood at the memorial services. It was the man who had been the helpful friend for 30 years. The biological roadmap had bypassed his professional mask and his decades of community service, leading the task force directly to his front door. The new evidence had done what 3 decades of traditional police work could not. It had bridged the gap between a 1990s crime and a 2025 reality. The silence of the evidence locker was over. The porcelain fragment and the second cousin's DNA had formed a pincer movement, trapping the suspect in a reality he thought he had outrun. As the task force prepared to act, they realized they weren't just making an arrest, they were witnessing the final collapse of a 30-year-old lie. The suspect believed he was invisible because he was too close to the victims. But in the world of modern forensics, closeness is exactly what leaves a trail. The light of 2025 was now shining directly on the one man who thought he would never be seen.
In the late autumn of 2025, the investigation transitioned from the dusty shelves of the archives to the sunlit streets of modern Ohio. The task force had a name, they had a history, they had a biological roadmap. But to cross the final threshold of justice, they needed a direct contemporary link. They needed a sample of DNA that belonged to the man as he existed today, not as a memory from 1996. This began the phase of the investigation known as the modern hunt. Unlike the loud, high-speed pursuits of television, the reality of high-tech surveillance is defined by extreme patience and quiet observation. For several weeks, the suspect was the subject of a meticulous study. Investigators moved in his orbit, unseen and unremarked upon. They watched a man who had mastered the art of the second life. Through long-range lenses, they observed his daily routine, a routine that was a masterpiece of suburban normalcy. Every morning at 7:45 a.m., he emerged from his well-appointed home, checking the mailbox with the same methodical care he had likely used for 3 decades. He would exchange a friendly wave with the neighbor walking a dog. He would pause to admire the frost on his lawn. There was a profound stillness to his movements, the composure of a man who believed the world had long ago stopped looking for his secrets. To any passerby, he was simply a successful, semi-retired professional enjoying the fruits of a long career. To the task force, he was a set of data points moving through a carefully constructed facade. The objective was clear: obtain a surreptitious sample. In the world of 2025 forensics, we don't always need a court-ordered blood draw to solve a 30-decade-old mystery. We only need the trace evidence that every human being leaves behind in their wake: a fingerprint on a glass, a stray hair, or a discarded piece of refuse. The breakthrough occurred on a crisp Thursday morning at a local coffee shop, a place where the suspect was a regular, known by name by the baristas. This was a setting defined by community and routine, the very things the suspect used as his armor. He entered the shop, ordered his usual beverage, and sat at a small table near the window. For 15 minutes he sat in the light, reading a digital tablet and sipping his drink, perfectly integrated into the morning rush of the town. When he finished, he performed a seemingly insignificant act. He wiped a small spill from the table with a standard white paper napkin, crumpled it, and placed it inside his empty paper cup. Then he walked to the waste bin near the exit, deposited the cup, and stepped out into the Ohio morning, continuing his day as if nothing had changed. He had no way of knowing that within seconds, an investigator, dressed as just another patron in a fleece jacket and baseball cap, had recovered that cup. The discarded item was immediately rushed to the state crime lab under a chain of custody that was absolute. This was the moment where the professional mask met the reality of the genetic code. The napkin contained epithelial cells, skin cells, and traces of saliva. In the lab, the process was swift. Using the same mineral DNA extraction principles that had unlocked the dental tool, the technicians isolated the genetic markers from the napkin. The wait was brief, but for the Miller family and the task force, those 48 hours felt like another 30 years. The question was no longer about theory or genealogical probability. It was about a direct match. When the results finally flickered onto the monitors in the cold case unit, the atmosphere changed instantly. The lab confirmed a 99.9% match between the DNA recovered from the coffee shop napkin and the biological material found on the blue latex glove and the dental elevator in 1996. The probability was so high that it reached the ceiling of scientific certainty. The man who had waved to his neighbors that morning, the man who had stood at the memorial services and offered comfort to the Miller children, was the same man who had left his biological signature at the crime scene 29 years earlier. The mask was officially slipping. The life of consistency he had built was no longer a shield. It was a record of the time he had stolen. The surveillance had proven that while a person can change their clothes, their business, and even their personality, they cannot change the fundamental blueprint of their existence. The task force now had everything they needed. The shadow that had hung over Wasion since 1996 was about to be burned away by the light of a laboratory report. The suspect returned home that evening, perhaps satisfied with his quiet morning at the coffee shop, unaware that the white napkin he had discarded was now the most important document in the state of Ohio. He had lived 30 years believing that silence was his greatest ally, but in the end, it was his own biology, left behind in a moment of mundane routine, that would provide the final word. The hunt was over. The observation was complete. The task force began to coordinate with local units for the next phase. They weren't going to a crime scene this time. They were going to a residence to bring a 30-year narrative to its long overdue conclusion. The model neighbor was about to meet the model of justice.
In the quiet, orderly world of suburban Ohio, we often believe that if the past is going to catch up to someone, it will happen in the shadows. We imagine a confrontation in a dark alley or a dramatic chase down a lonely highway. But the reality of 2025 was far more grounded and in many ways far more jarring. The conclusion of a 30-year mystery did not take place at a hidden retreat or a barricaded hideout. It took place in the bright, cheerful light of a Sunday morning, amidst the smell of fresh coffee and the comfort of a local tradition. The takedown of the primary suspect in the Miller investigation was a study in contrast. It was a crisp November morning, almost exactly 29 years to the day since the lights had gone out at the Miller residence. The suspect was enjoying a Sunday brunch at a popular establishment in the heart of town, a place where he was a fixture of the social scene. He was dressed in a well-pressed sweater, laughing at a joke, the picture of a man at peace with his legacy. When the specialized task force entered the restaurant, they didn't arrive with sirens or shouted commands. They moved with a quiet, professional efficiency that matched the environment. They approached the table as the suspect was raising a glass, and in a few low-spoken sentences, the life of consistency he had cultivated for 3 decades came to an abrupt, public end. There was no struggle. The suspect simply went quiet, his face losing its color as the reality of the situation finally bridged the 30-year gap.
As he was led out through the glass doors, the restaurant fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. What followed was a profound neighborhood disbelief. To the residents of Wauseon and the surrounding suburbs, the sight of this man in handcuffs was a sensory contradiction. This was not a name from a wanted poster. This was a man who occupied the highest rungs of their social ladder. In the hours following the arrest, the local news and social media were flooded with voices of shock. The sentiment was universal, not him. People spoke of his role as a grandfather, a man who was frequently seen playing with his grandchildren in his front yard, the very image of domestic stability. Others pointed to his status as a deacon in his local church, a man who had stood at the pulpit and spoken of morality, ethics, and the importance of community. To his neighbors, he was the person who helped clear snow from their driveways and offered professional advice without charging a fee. They struggled to reconcile the man who had served them communion or cheered at their children's soccer games with the biological evidence found on a 30-year-old latex glove. The community was forced to confront a difficult truth, that a person can be a pillar and a participant in a tragedy at the same time. But as the initial shock began to settle, the true nature of the betrayal began to emerge in the public reveal. The suspect was not a stranger who had targeted the Millers from afar. He was a former professional associate of Dr. Harrison Miller, a man who had worked in the same specialized field and shared the same professional circles for years. This was the man who had stood by the family's side in the devastating weeks of 1996. He was the one who had helped coordinate the initial memorial services. He had been a constant presence in the lives of the Miller children, offering them a narrative of support and friendship that spanned 3 decades. He had sat in their living rooms, listened to their grief, and watched them grow into adults, all while carrying the absolute truth of what had happened that November night. The reveal was a masterclass in the complexity of human behavior. It wasn't just that he had committed a crime, it was that he had successfully integrated that crime into a life of service and proximity. He had used his knowledge of the Millers' routines and his access to their professional world to commit an act that he then helped the community mourn. By staying close, he had been able to monitor the investigation from the inside, ensuring that his professional mask remained perfectly aligned with the expectations of the authorities. The arrest proved that his decades of kindness were not an atonement, but a continuation of the same calculation that had led him to the Miller home in 1996. He had bet that by becoming the most reliable person in town, he could make himself immune to suspicion. He believed that the community's affection for him as a grandfather and a deacon would act as a permanent shield against the forensic box in the basement. As the suspect was processed into the system in late 2025, the survivors were left with a new kind of pain. The man they had thanked for his support, the man they had trusted to honor their parents' memory, was the architect of their loss. The helpful friend was the final piece of the puzzle. The silence of the Ohio suburbs had been broken, not by a stranger, but the person who had been standing next to them the entire time. The Sunday brunch arrest served as a definitive marker. It was the moment the community realized that consistency is not always the same as integrity. The mask had not just slipped, it had been forcibly removed, leaving the town to look at one of its own and see for the first time the reality that had been hidden in plain sight.
In the wake of the arrest, one question remained that local gossip and standard police work could not satisfy. Why? Why would a man with a respected career, a family, and a standing as a deacon in his church risk everything to shatter a life of consistency? In late 2025, the task force unearthed the final piece.
During a court-authorized search of the suspect's long-term residence, a home he had occupied since the late 90s, investigators discovered a small, fireproof safe hidden behind a false panel in his basement workshop. Inside was a relic of a bygone digital era, a first-generation encrypted external drive, a device that had been considered state-of-the-art in 1996. For 30 years, this drive had held a collection of digital files that the suspect believed were beyond the reach of the law. He had banked on the encryption of the 90s being an eternal barrier, but the forensic computational power of 2025 operates on a different plane. When the data was finally decrypted, the ghost case revealed its internal logic. It wasn't a story of sudden passion or irrational hatred. It was a story of professional envy. The files contained a series of scanned documents and drafts for a secret partnership agreement. In the months leading up to November 1996, Dr. Harrison Miller and the suspect had been in deep negotiations to merge their practices into a regional dental conglomerate. This merger wasn't just a business deal, it was a transition that would have been worth millions of dollars in 1996 currency, a fortune that would have secured the suspect's life of consistency forever and erased the growing debts we discussed in earlier tasks. However, the digital trail revealed a sudden shift in the narrative. Harrison, ever the man of integrity, had discovered irregularities in the suspect's financial contributions to the merger. Harrison had sent a final private email found on the encrypted drive stating that he was withdrawing from the partnership and intended to report the financial discrepancies to the state dental board the following morning. This was the catalyst. It wasn't about the man Harrison was, it was about the millions of dollars he represented and the threat he now posed to the suspect's carefully constructed professional mask. To the suspect, Harrison Miller was no longer a friend or a colleague, he was a barrier to a future of unlimited prosperity. The suspect wanted that partnership and the wealth it promised for himself without the oversight or the moral compass of Dr. Miller. Using the recovered logs, witness statements from the original file, and the physical layout of the home, the task force was able to perform the confrontation, a reconstruction of the final conversation that took place in the Miller's kitchen. Imagine the scene. It is a cold Tuesday night in November 1996. The suspect arrives at the Miller residence. He isn't a masked intruder. He is a familiar face, a man with whom Harrison had shared countless professional victories. He is invited in. The snow is falling outside, muffling the world, as Harrison and the suspect stand in the warm, brightly lit kitchen. The conversation begins under the guise of a final appeal. The suspect tries to convince Harrison to reconsider the merger, to look past the irregularities. But Harrison, the model neighbor whose life was defined by a commitment to the truth, refuses. He explains that his decision is final. He believes in the consistency of the law as much as he believes in the consistency of his practice. In that kitchen, amidst the mundane sounds of a ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator, the suspect realizes that his second life is at risk. If Harrison goes to the board, the debts will be exposed, the deacon's mask will shatter, and the professional envy that has fueled him for years will be laid bare for the entire community to see. The conversation doesn't end with a compromise. It ends with the suspect making a choice to preserve his own status at the cost of the lives of the people who trusted him most. The silence that followed was not just the absence of life, it was a calculated move to reset the narrative. The suspect stepped out of that kitchen and back into the snow, leaving behind the blue latex glove and the dental tool, believing that the darkness of 1996 would swallow the truth forever. He spent the next 30 years convincing himself that he had won. He watched the Miller children grow up, knowing that their loss was the price of his continued prosperity. He utilized the very wealth and status he had protected to become a pillar of the community, an irony that the digital files now made painfully clear. The envy hadn't gone away, he had simply traded one mask for another. The recovery of these files in 2025 proved that the truth is often found in the margins of a person's ambition. The Millers didn't lose their lives to a random act, they lost them to a secret partnership agreement that existed only in the digital shadows. The suspect had carried the weight of that kitchen conversation for nearly 30 years, but the encrypted drive proved that even the most well-hidden secrets have a way of surfacing when the technology of the future finally catches up to the crimes of the past. The motive was finally unmasked. It wasn't a mystery of the soul, it was a mystery of the ledger. The life of consistency that Harrison Miller lived had been cut short by a man who valued the veneer of perfection more than the lives of his friends. As we move toward the final sentencing, the community of Wauseon is left to reflect on how a secret worth millions could be hidden for so long behind a Sunday brunch and a deacon's smile.
In the spring of 2026, the silence that had defined the Miller case for 3 decades was finally replaced by the measured, public record of a courtroom. This was the moment where the life of consistency that the suspect had manufactured met the absolute accountability of the law. The 2026 court appearance was not a theater of high-stakes legal maneuvering, but a quiet, crushing realization of the truth. The man who entered the courtroom was no longer the defiant businessman or the charismatic deacon who had charmed the suburbs of Ohio. Stripped of his professional mask and his expensive wool sweaters, he appeared as he truly was, an individual who had spent more than half his life maintaining a fiction. When the genetic evidence was presented, the 99.9% match from the coffee shop napkin and the microscopic porcelain from the dental elevator, the suspect finally stopped pretending. There were no more explanations, no more appeals to his standing in the community. In a low, barely audible voice, he acknowledged the reality of November 1996. The town that had once revered him watched from the gallery as the veneer of perfection finally and permanently dissolved. The sentencing served as a definitive marker for the survivors and the community. The judge spoke of the profound weight of a 30-year secret, noting that the suspect had used the very grief of the Miller family to insulate himself from justice. When the final term was read, life without the possibility of parole, there was no cheering. Instead, there was a collective, deep exhale. It was the sound of a community finally allowing itself to breathe after carrying a weight it hadn't fully understood for nearly 30 years. But justice in 2026 is about more than just a prison sentence. It is about reclaiming the narrative of those who were lost. Today, the site of the former dental practice has been transformed into a living legacy. A new public park dedicated to Dr. Harrison and Diane Miller now stands as a place of true peace. It is a space defined by open paths, bright gardens, and a commemorative plaque that honors their genuine commitment to Wauseon. It is a place where the children they left behind can sit in the sun, knowing that their parents' names are no longer synonymous with an unsolved mystery, but with a restored sense of truth. The Miller case teaches us that time is not a shield, and normalcy is not a guarantee of integrity. We often look at the pillars of the community, the successful professionals, the helpful neighbors, the vocal leaders, and assume that their public success is a reflection of their private history. But as we have seen in this investigation, the most polished facades can sometimes hide the most calculated choices. If a 30-year secret can be found in a suburban kitchen, tucked away in an evidence locker and an encrypted drive, we must ask ourselves a difficult question. Who else is currently walking among us with a hidden past?
In every town, there are stories that don't quite add up. There are individuals whose sudden success or quiet consistency masks a history they hope the world has forgotten. The Miller case proves that the technology of the future is steadily closing the gaps of the past. The biological roadmaps are being mapped, the digital shadows are being illuminated, and the silence is being broken one cold case at a time. Thank you for following this investigation with us. The story of the Millers is a reminder that the truth doesn't have an expiration date and that no secret is safe once the light of science and the persistence of justice are applied. If you believe in the importance of bringing these ghost cases back into the light, please subscribe to Cold Case Reviews. Your support allows us to continue digging into the files that have been left in the dark for too long. I want to hear your thoughts on this case. Comment below. What local pillar of the community in your area has a story that doesn't quite add up? Are there names in your town that carry a shadow, or cases from the 90s that are still waiting for their 2026 breakthrough? Let's start the conversation and ensure that no story is ever truly forgotten. Stay observant, stay questioning, and remember that the most ordinary faces often